Welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamisha Al-Sendor. This week, gun reform efforts on Capitol Hill continued following the high-profile mass shootings in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York. On Wednesday, survivors and parents of recent mass shooting victims testified before Congress.
Shot my teacher and told my teacher goodnight and shot her in the head. And then he shot some of my classmates. He shot my friend that was next to me. And I thought he was going to come back to the room. So I grabbed the blood and put it all over me.
Lexi received the Good Citizen Award and was also recognized for receiving all A's. To celebrate, we promised to get her ice cream that evening. I told her we loved her and we would pick her up after school. And then we left. I left my daughter at that school, and that decision will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Just heartbreaking. Zanita Everhart, whose son Zaire was shot in Buffalo, New York, also described his injuries.
As I clean his wounds, I can feel pieces of that bullet in his back. Shrapnel will be left inside of his body for the rest of his life. You are elected because you have been chosen and are trusted to protect us. But let me say to you here today, I do not feel protected. If after hearing from me and the other people testifying here today does not move you to act on gun laws, I invite you to my home to help me clean Zaire's wounds so that you may see up close the damage that has been caused to my son and to my community.
Amid all of this, a bipartisan group of senators say they are optimistic that their negotiations over a narrow package could get the 60 posts and 60 votes needed to pass the Senate. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Leanne Caldwell, Washington Post live anchor and the co-author of the Early 202 newsletter, and Nicole Killian, congressional correspondent for CBS News. Thank you, both of you, for sticking around with me. Nicole, I want to go first to you. How is this pain, these emotional testimonies? And we should say that Matthew McConaughey was also at the White House urging lawmakers to do something. How is all of this sort of emotional conversation impacting the negotiations? Are lawmakers sort of feeling more of a sense of urgency?
Well, I think they have ever since this Uvalde shooting and also the one in Buffalo occurred. Certainly for those who have been working on the issue, like Chris Murphy and others. But look, I mean, this was a rough week. Make no mistakes. I mean, we saw in terms of that testimony from, Mia Cirillo, fourth grader, having to talk about putting blood on her body just to stay alive. I mean, there was hardly a dry eye in that committee room as you watched lawmakers listen to that testimony, not only from her, but her father, from this physician who graphically described some of the wounds that he saw. And then in terms of the Buffalo victims as well, I talked to a lot of those families, and even in spite of all of the trauma they are suffering too. I talked to Garnell Whitfield Jr., whose 86-year-old mother was killed in that Tops grocery store shooting, and I asked him how confident he was if Congress would get something done, and so he said he's not naive, but he's hopeful. So, look, I think these families feel, or at least hope, that maybe their message has resonated, but as we know, the House passed a series of comprehensive measures this week. The Senate, the dialogue continues, so it's not necessarily moving the needle immediately in the Senate, but there is cautious optimism that maybe they can find this narrow compromise in the Senate, but clearly they're going past this deadline of trying to reach a deal by the end of this week.
And Leanne, jump in here. Of course, I know you've been doing a lot of reporting on what these negotiations are feeling like, looking like, sounding like. What are you hearing?
Well, I want to be clear that the negotiations between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, these are not sweeping gun reform measures. It's adjustments to current law, perhaps to strengthen current law. They are very intent on doing what Republicans want, and that is strengthening schools, giving schools the resources. High schools after Columbine have already got a lot of resources to, quote, harden the schools. Now they're talking about doing that more from elementary and middle school, which is also tragic in its face. Providing more resources for mental health support, especially that target audience who has been really the profile of the shooters, these 18 to 21, 22-year-old young men. As far as actual gun safety reform is concerned, they're talking perhaps about strengthening red flag laws. But as my colleague Mike DeBonis and I reported yesterday, there's a lot of skittishness even among Republicans. They're worried about due process and the fact that someone can go claim that another person is a danger with no proof, and that person can have their guns taken away. So there's still a lot of unsettled things around there. And then the final thing is background checks. There's no talk about expanding background checks, but perhaps being able to go into a newly turned 18-year-old's juvenile record to go into their background to see if there's anything there, something that's not possible now. And so hopefully these things will get passed. Hopefully there's agreement, perhaps. That's what Democrats and many Republicans want. But the impact is still, if it comes to pass, it's unknown how broad this impact will be.
And Nicole, you also talked about sort of the House and what they're passing. I want to circle back on that. What, if anything, coming out of the House can pass the Senate? Is there sort of any sort of feeling that something that the House is producing will be passed by the Senate?
No. In short. I mean, and look, the House knows that. I mean, to a certain extent, this is like a messaging bill in terms of this Protect Our Kids Act package that the House passed this week, which would, potentially raise the purchasing age on semi-automatic weapons to 21, make requirements for safe storage of guns, ban high-capacity magazines. I mean, we know that Senate Republicans aren't going to go that far. We did also see a separate bill pass. It was sponsored by Lucy McBath, who introduced that measure that would, in essence, nationalize these red flag laws that would prevent someone from getting a gun if they are deemed to be a threat on a temporary basis. But even that, as Leanne pointed out, there are concerns with respect to due process. So even that probably wouldn't make a lot of headway in the Senate. And also worth noting that there are two background checks that are bills that are still sitting in the Senate as well, which we know the majority leader did put on the calendar. But once these bipartisan talks got underway, they kind of hit the pause button on that. So it really remains to be seen. I think in terms of Democrats, they feel that this may be an issue that can galvanize voters this November, even if they don't get the bigger gains that they would like to see on this issue.
And I want to, now we've obviously talked about what happened on Capitol Hill, what is happening on Capitol Hill. Leanne, I want to turn to what happened in Uvalde, Texas, because we're still learning so many new details. This week, the New York Times reports heavily armed officers waited an hour to confront the gunman, even as on-scene supervisors were told that wounded students, the little children, were trapped inside. Reports say that more than a dozen students, a dozen little kids, remained alive for over an hour before officers entered that classroom. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, personally, if I was a parent in Uvalde, infuriating. I mean, you can't even express the anger. I'm a parent of two children, and putting myself in that position, I could not even imagine knowing that there were armed people. There were children calling 911 from inside that room, and the armed officers were outside the door. The cops were already there and not doing anything. There's a Department of Justice investigation. There's, I think, a Texas state investigation as well, as there should be. These are the safeguards that have been put in place, absent any sort of gun reform or gun control, to protect schools, and it failed at every single level. And so there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and it's going to be a very difficult process.
And Nicole, finally to you, I just wonder what your reaction is to this news that we're hearing about these police officers, that we're going to hear, of course, more, because there's so many more questions that need to be answered.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, to Leanne's point as well, and I'm a parent of two young kids just under the age of those students there. I mean, one can only imagine what was going on in that time that elapsed. I mean, certainly there was a report of one mother whose instinct just kicked in and she went into that classroom for herself and yanked her kids out. I mean, I feel like that's something I probably would do too. But, you know, hindsight is 2020. And, you know, you heard the family of Lexi Rubio there talk about, you know, how that decision to leave their child at school that day will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So, I mean, this is going to be a very difficult issue that weighs with parents. I mean, we'll see if any legal action is taken going forward, but it does raise even more questions about this response as we learn more details about this investigation.
Certainly a lot of questions for the police officers and the police response there. Well, we'll have to leave it there tonight. Thank you to Leanne and Nicole for joining us and for sharing your reporting. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.